Well, thank you, Riverview, and lovely to be with you, be you here in person or be you online. Really nice that so many are watching online as well, but very, very good to be with you today. And if you've got Bibles, I'm in the Genesis 32, 33 kind of zone of the Bible. So if you've got something there that you like to follow along, feel free to do that. Hey, some of you know that for 17 years I was principal of a seminary. What you might not know is that when I was much younger, I was also principal of a Bible college back in South Africa. And I was 31 years old at that time, probably too young to really be doing that job. But I was very grateful for the chairman of the board there, Dr. Bob Leyburn. He became a good friend to me, a little bit of a mentor. He was much older than I was. I used to think of him as an old man, though realistically he was probably about my age now. I was just so impressed because he held a very significant job. He poured his time into the Bible college. He poured his time into the church. He poured his time into a wealth of other really worthwhile organizations. And I just thought this man is quite extraordinary. And I asked him once, Bob, you know, why do you do this? And how do you find the energy to do that? And he said, well, Brian, you don't fully know my story. But for me, there came a day that was this line in the sand day. I was in an aeroplane crash. And he said that in that crash, and from memory, I think it was the plane that crashed somewhere over Zambia. He said, in that crash, almost everyone was killed. I was one of the very, very few survivors. And he said it was in a very remote area, and there was just chaos after the plane came down. And I was actually alive, and I was rushed off to a remote little village hospital, but because communication networks were so poor, no one actually knew that they'd done that. And so when my family were trying to find out what had happened to me, no one could tell them that I was there, and it was assumed that I died. And for a week, my family just assumed that I was one of those who had been killed in this crash. And he said that when I was recovering, I had these flashbacks every night, and it was this flashback. And in the flashback, I was always asking myself this question: what if I had been sitting in a different seat? What if I had been sitting in a different seat? Because if I had, I almost certainly would have been killed. And then he said, and so I asked myself, if I had been killed in that crash as almost everyone else was, what would my life have amounted to? And he said, I came to the conclusion that the answer was not very much at all. And I vowed that because God had given me my life back, as it were, that I would live very differently from that day on. And he said, and one of the mottos for my life has been, it's like a little ditty, but it is fundamental and it's deeply true. Only one life, it will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. Only one life, it will soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. And he said, I've tried to build my life in that, and I've tried to live in the light of that, and I've tried to live to make a difference. Bob was talking about those days, they don't necessarily come very often, but they come once in a while. They are defining moments. They are line in the sand moments where you just know my life cannot carry on in exactly the same way into the future. And this passage, which we're going to look at today, a passage about Jacob, is for him, it's a line in the sand day. His life cannot carry on in exactly the same way afterwards. And so I want us to look there. Let's ask about some questions about Jacob. So if you know who Jacob is one of the three patriarchs of Israel. The three patriarchs were Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Now you might assume that being one of the patriarchs of Israel, and it was after all his 12 children, they're going to name the 12 tribes of Israel, so very, very significant. You might assume that he would have been a remarkably good and really nice person, and you would be completely wrong. And because actually he wasn't a particularly nice person. One of the things that is so remarkable about the Christian Bible is that unlike other ancient literature, when you read pretty much every other piece of ancient literature from the past, you find that it's about these extraordinary heroes or these absolutely terrible, terrible villains. But as Jonathan Sacks has said, the remarkable thing about the Bible is that as you read it, you discover that the villains have virtues and the heroes have flaws. These are nuanced characters. Because why? Because it is the story of us. And all of us are, in fact, these mixed and muddled people. Now the name Jacob means he clutches, he schemes, he deceives, he cheats. I mean, I'm sorry if your name is Jacob. I don't know if you actually realize that, but it's like, what were your parents thinking? And And you do know what Jacob's parents were thinking, because he's born a twin. And as he's born a twin, as he comes out, he's clutching at his brother's Esau's heel. Now he's doing that because instinctively, as an infant, even as a baby, he seems to have known the ancient code, which was basically this: the firstborn, even the firstborn of the twin, has a completely different lot in life to someone who comes second, third, fourth, or fifth. If you're the firstborn, you become the patriarch of the family. If you're the firstborn, you get double the inheritance. If you're the firstborn, all kinds of responsibilities come your way. If you're the firstborn, you are the significant one. And it is though, even as we're told that during Rebecca's pregnancy, she has a horrendous time as these boys in her womb just fight to kind of jostle to, who can be closest to exit one day, who can get out first. And it turns out that Esau wins, but it's not without a struggle. And it's as though Jacob, as Esau pops out, Jacob is like clutching onto his heels and saying, come back, I'm going to pull you back in and I'm going to shoot out ahead of you. Thank you very much. But he doesn't succeed. And his loss defines his life. And all his life, he's trying to make up for the fact that he is not the firstborn, not the one with all the special privileges. And so he schemes and he plots, and he's really not a very nice person at all. And you find that, in fact, he succeeds in many ways. He manages to outwit Esau and to get Esau to sell him his birthright for just some food one day. And then he tricks his father Isaac, who in his old age is pretty much blind and can't see properly anymore. He fools his father that he's actually Esau, and he gets Isaac to proclaim the blessing over Jacob, which Isaac thought he was proclaiming over Esau. But sometimes in life you can overplay your hand. Sometimes you can be so intent on getting something and so determined to get it come what may that you don't realize the price that you're going to pay for doing it. And this absolutely happens for Jacob, because after he tricks Isaac into giving him Esau's blessing, Esau is furious and plans to kill him. And Jacob very quickly realizes that Esau's not messing around and that his life is in danger. He has to flee for his life. And he flees. His mother guides him to the home of Laban, his uncle, his mother's brother. And when he's there, he discovers where his genes have come from. Because if he's a schemer, if he's kind of this lying, deceitful, clutching one, well, it came from a gene pool in that family, and his uncle Laban was kind of the schemer on steroids. Absolutely. And for the first time in his life, Jacob discovers that he has been out-schemed and outwitted. And the first time it happens is actually quite, depending on your perspective, it's very funny. From Jacob's point of view, it was seriously unfunny. But Jacob gets tricked into marrying the wrong person by Laban. So what happens is Laban has two daughters, Rachel, who is lovely, and the first time Jacob sets eyes on her, he just falls in love with her and wants to marry her. And says to Laban, you don't want to marry her, what must I do? And Laban says, you must work for me for 7 years. And what's really a very beautiful passage in Scripture, we're told that Jacob works for her for 7 years, and it seems like nothing at all, because he's so in love with her. Real, true love waits, and he waits for her. And the 7 years pass by, and the wedding day comes. But Laban has a problem, because he has another daughter, an older daughter. Her name is Leah. And, well, she's Leah, that's all that can be said. And no one is planning to marry Leah, and that's not acceptable. And so what Laban does is that he gets Jacob. We're not quite sure just how this happens. The story, perhaps mercifully, is a little bit vague in its detail. But it basically tells us that Jacob goes to his marital bed, presumably kind of pretty drunk. And it's actually Leah who's there. And he doesn't notice the difference. And he wakes up in the morning, and to his horror, says, and who are you? What are you doing here? You're not Rachel, you're Leah. And says, yes, surprise, surprise. And he discovers that he's married her. And in terms of the custom of the time, that's it, done, he's married. And he goes back to Laban, and you would have thought that Laban might have done a good deal for him, a kind of a 2-for-1 deal, but no. he says, right, you can still have the Rachel whom you love, but you've got to work for me another 7 years. Thank you very much. No, you can work after the marriage, and lets him marry quite quickly, but he's still 14 years. That Jacob has to work for these 2 daughters, one of whom he didn't even want, but that's the way it was. And Jacob, as he's there, learns from Laban to scheme so much that in the end he actually out-schemes Laban himself. So, all the early rounds go to Laban, but later on it is as though Jacob is learning more and more, and he out-schemes and he outwits, and he becomes, in the end, someone who manages to take away most of Laban's fortune from him. And not too surprisingly, he discovers that Laban's attitude towards him cools. That's what Genesis chapter 31 verse 2 says, that after Jacob has out-schemed Laban, he noticed that there was a considerable cooling in the attitude towards him, and he no longer felt welcome or entirely safe where he was. You see, sometimes in life when you win an argument, especially if it's in a family, you lose. Sometimes the most unwise thing is to win a marital argument. I mean, have you ever kind of been in an argument and said, I told you so? And I mean, even as you say that, this is extraordinarily foolish territory that you entered into. I've now been married for over 40 years, and the reason that I have been married for over 40 years is because I've very rarely said, I told you so. And on those rare occasions I have, it has been frosty indeed for quite a while. So Jacob wins, but he really loses. And I won't go into all the details, but by the end of Genesis chapter 31, they're parting company. And we're told, and it is really quite sad, that Laban and Jacob put together a pile of stones, and they build a pillar. And they basically say, Laban says, I'm on this side of this pillar, you on that side, and we never cross again. We never cross again. This is the line in the sand. Jacob, you must go back to your home. You're no longer welcome here, and you will never come back here again. Now, the trouble is that Jacob can't go back to Laban, but it means that he's therefore got to go in this journey to his brother Esau. And the last time he had met Esau, it had been 20 years ago to be sure, but the last time he had met him, his brother had been saying that he was going to kill him. And so he sends off like this little recce party to find out what Esau's attitude towards him might be. And they come back and they say, your brother Esau has heard that you're returning, and he is coming towards you with 400 men. Now imagine you're Jacob. Imagine you're Jacob. You can't go back to Laban. Can't do that. You've burnt your bridges there. You've got to keep moving on ahead, and you're told your brother is coming towards you with, not just on his own, not just with 1 or 2 friends, with 400 men. It is a time of great crisis. And Jacob the schemer immediately goes into scheming mode. And we're told, if you look at Genesis chapter 32, verses 6 to 9, when the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. In great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups, and the flocks and the herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. Now let me make just a couple of comments here. I said that though Jacob is one of the great patriarchs of Israel, he wasn't really a particularly godly man. And he had been a schemer, and he had always been used to having to sort out everything on his own. And this is one of those times again. And he immediately hears there's trouble, and so he thinks, and you can understand his thinking, he's basically saying, if we're going to survive, I've got to divide this group up into 2, because maybe one of them will get killed, but maybe at least half of us will survive. That's his line of thinking. That's his scheming. In his journey with God, Jacob hasn't really moved very far at all. But straight after this is enough of a crisis that we are told that after he does this, after he divides the group into 2, he prays. And it's actually a very beautiful prayer that he prays. And he prays that if God will rescue him and help him, then he will serve him. And you suddenly realize that in Jacob's journey, he's come to this place where in the past, he was Jacob the schemer. Now he's come to the stage where he is Jacob the praying schemer. And like to be a praying schemer is better than to just be a schemer. It's progress. It's like he's moving along a little bit. I mean, he is after all one of the patriarchs of Israel, the founders of faith. So it's nice he's making some progress. But sometimes it's like that, isn't it? Like in journeys of faith. I don't know about your own journey. Some of you might, if you're honest, you kind of every now and then you find that you can trust God, but it's not something you do very instinctively. I can remember when I was pastoring back in Umhlanga many years ago. There was a man who kind of went to the church one day. Service was about to begin, and I suddenly noticed there was a man in the church, and I knew his reputation in the town was he had the nickname in the town of being the Godfather. And wherever he went, there were a couple of bodyguards who went around with him, and that was because he had cheated people in business in various ways, and he was afraid that all kinds of repercussions might come upon him. And so I was very surprised to see the Godfather there, and I thought, well, goodness, I better be careful about what I say and not be too offensive and not too fiery a servant, thank you very much today. But, he came and went, and I was surprised. Then the next week he was there again, and the next week as well. And I thought, that's really interesting. What's happening here? And then he said to me, Brian, I'd like to come and see you. And I must admit, I was a tad anxious. So I said, okay, sure. And he came, made a meeting with me, and when he came, he said, Brian, I'd like to give a donation to the church. Well, that's always good news. So thank you very much. And he said, is it possible for it to have a tax deduction as well? And I said, well, no, actually, we don't do tax deductions here because we couldn't. And I thought that then he wouldn't kind of give to us. But actually he did, and was actually a very generous sum of money. I was quite surprised. And a few weeks later, he came to me and said, Brian, we're starting a new business. I'm starting up a new business here. And I want to invite you along to the opening, and I want you to pray for us, because I remember you preached in church a few weeks back, Psalm 127, unless the Lord builds a house, they that build it labor in vain. I thought, okay. I must admit, I thought, I'm not sure that I'm entirely comfortable about praying for this business. Lord, bless this place as it rips everyone off in the town. I'm not sure about that, but I'm not comfortable about not saying no, because I might not be alive if I say no. So anyway, whether I did the right thing or the wrong thing, who knows, but I agreed to go. And went there, and there's this great opening event, and champagne was flowing everywhere, and I felt awkward many times, because people always come to you and say, so who are you? What's your relationship here? And I said, well, actually, I'm the pastor of the local Baptist church. They're like, seriously, what are you doing here? And then the Godfather introduces me and says, I'd like to introduce you to my pastor, who's going to pray that God will bless. I mean, you could have, there was just this frozen silence in this place. We're going to pray, and the pastor's going to pray, like these champagne glasses almost shattered in people's hands as they're so shocked. And I prayed, and I didn't really know what to pray. God protect the city from this place. But I prayed as some kind of prayer that seemed to be acceptable, because I'm still alive today. And but when I was driving away, I thought, he's been a schemer, but he's not a praying schemer. And he's making some progress and something's happening. And it reminded me that people, all of us, are on journeys, aren't we? And it's not just like the Godfather back there, but it's also Jacob, this godly patriarch of Israel on this journey. And you know what? Maybe it's you as well. Maybe you're here today, and maybe you're a little bit surprised that you're here, and you wonder what you're doing here and think, this is not really my place. I mean, I'm not a churchy kind of person, thank you very much. But God meets people in their journeys, and maybe he's just meeting you today. And one of the greatest heroes of the faith, Jacob, that was him. And he comes to this place, and he knows that he's facing a great crisis. And there is this line in the sand, and things are going to be different afterwards. Well, he sends everyone away. And I mean, the nice thing about praying schemers is that God doesn't leave them alone. And God, in fact, gets Jacob to send everyone away, and we're told that he is left completely on his own. And listen to the passage. It's very poignant, as I'll read it to us. Genesis 32 from verse 24. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with human beings and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Just imagine how strange this scene was. Just imagine it. It's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, imagine the Australian outback, because the countryside's very similar as you go to that part of the Near East. So he's there and he's on his own, and in this deserted desert-like terrain, suddenly there's just a man who's there. And the man comes to him and says, you want to wrestle? I mean, put yourself there. What would you say? I imagine Jacob said, actually, I'll pass if that's okay. And the man says, not okay, we're going to wrestle. And Jacob says, okie dokie, if you say so. And suddenly they're wrestling. And surprisingly, Jacob does quite well. I mean, the initial kind of opening gambit of Jacob's life is that he's kind of very much his mother's favorite son, and he does quiet, kind of at-home kinds of activities. But the years in the wilderness have toughened him, and he now is actually strong, and he fights back vigorously. Now, let me just pause here, because I'm wanting us to see what we can learn about God encounters here. I'm wanting us to see what we can learn about God encounters here. If I'm going to say to you, this is a God encounter that Jacob's about to have, I wonder what goes into your mind. Because sometimes when we think of God encounters, we think of very dramatic things that just can't be missed, and it's just obvious that this is God. I mean, I can remember a number of years back now, I grew up in Durban, and I was at a meeting, and a man was giving his testimony of how he came to faith. And he said that he had been an atheist, and he said, he just didn't believe in God at all. But he said he had gotten himself into a bit of a pickle because there were two young women that he just was wildly in love with. The one's name was Margaret, the other's name was Dilly. And he said he just couldn't decide, who should he marry? Should it be Margaret? Should it be Dilly? And neither knew that the other existed, and he wasn't comfortable, and he realized that bigamy wasn't an option, and he was just trying to decide. And one day, some of you, I don't know if any of you come from Durban, I grew up there, I can still picture the scene. He was driving down Allowell Street, passing the little Allowell Street Congregational Church, and in perplexed kind of just despair and just not knowing what to do. Should he marry Margaret? Should he marry Dilly? He just said, God, if there is a God, I know you don't exist, but if by any chance you do exist, just show me, who must I marry? Prove to me, tell me, who I must marry. And he looked up, and there in Allowell Street is the Piccadilly Theatre, and in neon lights was the word Piccadilly, but the A had gone out. And the neon lights said simply Piccadilly, just like that. And I think you're speaking. I think you exist, God. I think you might be real. And he actually came to faith, and he married Dilly, and happy about him, was telling his testimony that night. That's how he came to faith in Jesus. Now, I don't know if something like that has happened to you, but once in a while, God does these extraordinary things for people, and he kind of breaks through it, like you just can't miss it. This is God, and you've got to be seriously stupid not to notice that that's God. But most often it's a little more subtle, isn't it? So put yourself there in Jacob's position. I mean, it's this bizarre situation, this weirdo who's just wrestling with him, and he's trying very hard, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And while he's wrestling, the man suddenly knocks him on his hip, and his hip goes out of joint. Now that's actually quite unusual to happen. That's probably the strongest part of your body. So it's like the position of strength, and suddenly his hip out of joint, he just clings to this man. But then he is the clutcher, isn't he? He's Jacob, the clutcher. So he's clutching onto this man because he can't stand up anymore, and he's wondering what's going on. And listen to what the passage tells us. Who is this that he is wrestling with? Who is this that he's wrestling with? Let's read it again. I'll just read sections of it. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Verse 25, the man saw that he could not overpower him. Also verse 25, his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Verse 26, then the man said, let me go. Verse 27, the man asked him, what is your name? Verse 28, then the man said, verse 30, I saw God face to face. Oh, do you see what's happened there? Six times, the passage says, the man, the man, the man, the man, the man, the man. Seventh time, I saw God. And suddenly he realizes that in the midst of all his wrestling, it's not just a man, it's God. And that's God right in the midst, and God is doing something with him. And it's extraordinarily important that we actually grasp this, because so often we fight with things and we're in such a struggle and we are wrestling and it seems bizarre and we cannot understand what's going on and we assume that something terrible must be happening, and actually the man, no, God trying to get our attention. God helping us to cross a new line. God helping us to see something in a completely different way. So maybe your work situation seems absolutely impossible. Maybe your marriage seems absolutely impossible. Maybe your relationships seem completely impossible. And just like this, terrible. No, God somehow in the midst saying, time to see things differently. Time to get a new name. Time to have a new opening. And you know what? It's not just for us at an individual level. I have heard so many people say, I'm so despairing about the church in Australia and around the world at the moment. So many terrible things seem to be happening. I mean, just look at all these leaders who've fallen off their perches. Great people. So many disappointments. Haven't you been disappointed? And as we dig into the past, we discovered all these instances of sexual abuse and things that have been wrong. And we had the risk of losing a whole measure of religious freedom. And you say, God, what is happening? And we say, this must be demonic. It's terrible. All these awful things that are happening. And the more we complain, the more God says, I beg your pardon. I beg your pardon. Don't you think that I am wrestling with you? Don't you think that I am saying to you, why would I want to keep a church like that? Why would I want to keep a church with leaders who in fact are not doing the right things? Why would I run a church where people are just obsessed with kind of charisma and leaders who are larger than life? Why would we want a church like that? I mean, I'm supposed to be the head of the church. Why are you worshiping people the whole time? And why are you trying to cover up things in the past that are wrong? And why are you doing all these things that you should not defend? Don't you see that I'm wrestling with you? Because the church is supposed to be pure. She's supposed to be the bride of Christ. She's supposed to be holy. She's supposed to be love in the world. And what you're wrestling with is not the demonic. It is me saying, come, be the church that you're called to be. Be the church that you're called to be. Be the hope of the world that you're called to be. You see, we can so quickly say, it's tragic, it's terrible, things are out of control. Beg your pardon, God is always in control. God is always in control. God is always in control. And the man turns out to be none other than God. And as Jacob wrestles with him, the man turns to him and says, and what is your name? What is your name? That dreaded question, because Jacob never liked his name, did he? And he has to say, I am Jacob. I am the one who schemes. I am the one who clutches. I am the one who clings. I am the one who cheats. That's who I am. And God says to him, no more, that is no longer your name. You will be Israel, because you will be someone who has struggled with God and with people and has prevailed. No, it's interesting. He doesn't say to Jacob, your name will be Israel because now you're going to have this really easy life and things will be so comfortable for you. He said, no, you're Israel because you're one who will struggle, but you will have the right struggles now. And you will struggle with God for what should happen in the world, and you will struggle with my people to be the people of God in the world. And suddenly these struggles will not be these selfish, petty little struggles that you've always had. They will be the right struggles to be my person in the world. Your name will be Israel. You have a new name. Now, here's the sobering thing. His name is Israel. Hold on. Who are we speaking about? I mean, who are we speaking about tonight? Tell me. Jacob. So why are we still thinking of him as Jacob? Here's the thing. As you go on in the story of Jacob, you find that in Scripture, his name is changed to Israel. And sometimes, when he stays close to God, he is called Israel. I mean, there are many times in Scripture where he is called Israel. But there are even more times when he is called Jacob. And tragically, most often, we still think of him as Jacob. What is the passage saying to us? You have a new name. You are a new creation. You are a child of God. You know what your name is? You are Christian. You're Christian. You're one who follows Jesus. That's the deepest truth about you. But so often we live out another name. And we fall back and we forget who we most truly are. God invites us to a new name, but we must live that name out. Jacob leaves that place, and he leaves, and the passage tells us that as he goes, he is limping. Never be afraid of limping. Never be afraid of limping. Never be afraid of seeming a little bit weak. It's, in your weakness that you're strong. It's when you're weak that you cling on to God. It's when you're limping that you're slow enough to hear the whispers of God. Jacob, what happens because of his God encounter? He has a new limp, he has a new name, but he also has a new vision. And let me close with this, because the passage finishes in just such wonderful territory. Genesis chapter 33. Jacob looked up, and there was Esau. He'd been dreading this encounter for 20 years. There was Esau coming with his 400 men. So he divided his children amongst Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front, Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph in the rear. He himself went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Wow. After the God encounter, he discovered that his enemy, Esau, was his brother. And his vision changed, and he saw the world differently. Sometimes it is that we have enemies in our minds, and they actually aren't enemies, they're brothers and sisters. There is a wonderful, wonderful Jewish story, you perhaps have heard it before, but it's worth hearing again and again and again and again. In some of the Jewish wisdom literature, the story is told. A rabbi is with his students. And the rabbi asks this question: how do you know that it is that nighttime is over and the daytime has begun? I mean, how can you tell? How much light do you need to actually come to the conclusion, no longer night, it's daytime? And one student raised his hand and said, Rabbi, I know when that is. It is when you look out over towards the sheep in the distance. And as you look at them, you can say, those are the sheep and that is the sheepdog. And you can tell the difference between them. Then there is enough light to say it's daytime. The day has begun. The night is over. And the rabbi said, no, that's wrong. And another student said, well, how about this? It is when you look out over your fields. And as you look to the orchards, you can say that is the olive trees, and that's where the vineyards are. And there's enough light that you can say, I can tell the difference between them. I can tell there's enough light to say that. Then the night is over and the day has begun. And the rabbi said, no, completely wrong. And so the student said, so tell us, how do you know when the night time is over and the day has begun? And the rabbi said, it is very, very easy. It is when you look in the face of another human being and see there your brother or your sister. Then the night is over. Then the day has begun. Then the night is over, the day has begun. When you look, Jacob, when you look and see Esau is not your enemy, Esau is your brother. And all these wasted 20 years were just that, wasted, scheming for no reason at all. But now you are Israel. Now fight the right battles, the battles that will transform the world. And I wonder about you, what is it that you are wrestling with? so anxious about, so burdened by? Could it be that God is in the midst of that, saying, I can actually bring something beautiful from it? And is God wanting to give you a new name? You might have a bit of a limp when you have it, but don't be afraid of limps. And develop this glorious new vision of brothers and sisters who are there and who need your love and who need the love of Jesus.